Welcome everybody to live Q&A. We're a little bit rusty at this. I think this is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic, and I think with me is Dan. Hi, Dan.
Yeah. So am I the pastor or the?
I think you're the recovering. Are you still recovering, or did you have a relapse?
I've had a relapse,
okay,
big relapse.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll,
the last hour.
We'll work on that one. Welcome. It's been a while.
It has been a while, a long time.
Yeah.
Too much stuff going on in the world.
Yes.
But amongst those many things going on in the world, we lost a pope and gained a new one.
We did gain a new one, yes.
So that I just thought would be a cool topic for today.
Okay.
Because, Luther had a couple thoughts about the papacy.
He did.
So it seems relevant, to these Lutheran crowd. Protestants in general.
Yes. I will warn everybody on the internet.
Thank you.
Having a confessional Lutheran pastor's opinion on how the papacy works is a little dangerous.
Yes.
So,
that's part of why I'm doing this. Is like my little go.
Take everything I say with a grain of salt,
Yeah.
So, but.
And as a recovering Catholic, this is going to be even more interesting.
Right. Recovering Catholic and a confessional Lutheran pastor. Talking about the papacy. The Vatican's dreams are made. They're longing for this content.
All right, so let's get to the...
Right, yeah.
Let's get to the very core.
Okay.
And start at the very beginning. A very good place to start.
Yes.
How did the papacy begin? I know I was taught that it goes directly back to Peter.
Yeah.
And it's an unblemished, unbroken line from Peter onward. So...
yeah.
And I know very, very early, there was no Vatican. It wasn't centralized. So when even though the claim is made that it goes directly back to Peter, when did the papacy really begin?
See, you're getting me in trouble. I can hear the Roman Catholics coming for me.
There's torches and pitchforks out front right now.
Okay, so there's this term in the New Testament, episkopos, right? Okay. It literally means overseer, is its literal Greek translation. We get the word bishop from it, episcopal, means overseer, right? And it's this term for leadership Paul uses in the church, right? And you'll find it in Paul's letters where he'll talk about the overseers and the qualification for being an overseer, yada, yada, yada.
Right. Have an MBA.
Well, right. It's, good, faithful family, wise, yada, yada, yada. Right. Okay. So from that term, we get the word bishop, right?
Okay.
That's where the origin of the word comes from, is bishop. We're not quite... If we're honest with ourselves, I'll leave Roman propaganda out of it for a moment.
Okay.
If we're honest with ourselves, we're not quite sure whether there was one overseer or whether this was like church council. There were multiple overseers. Like we're not quite sure.
And was this for each church?
Yeah,
That's what he meant.
a church would right, and we're not quite sure. Is there like one? Is it like a executive council and all the people are episcopos on it? Like we're not. It's unclear. So we have that problem, right? But eventually, and not all that like long after the Bible, we get the end of the biblical texts and into what we call the apostolic fathers, who are this generation that bridges the gap from the apostles to who we later call the church fathers.
Okay.
The apostolic fathers are this generation that they were the disciples of the disciples. So
they're like the first generation.
Yeah, after the disciple. Right.
Okay.
So Polycarp is a famous one, and supposedly he was a disciple of John the disciple. Yeah. Right. And we have, and these are the people we have writings from. Right. We have writings from these dudes.
So they're basically our direct connection to the people who actually were taught by Jesus himself.
Right. They're our direct connection.
Okay.
Right. We have writings from some of them. So you get this, and by that point already, the episcopos role has morphed into a singular bishop.
Wow, in just one generation.
Yeah, right. So like whether it may have already always been that way, or it may have transformed that way, but very quickly you get that basically each city, right, has a episcopos, a bishop, right?
Okay. Though there may be many churches, many congregations within that city.
Yeah, there may be, just like today, right?
Yeah.
Like there are many congregations within our synod, right?
Now, is that where we get the term metropolitan?
That's a different thing.
Okay.
So
we'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
So you have a bishop of like a city or a region, usually a city, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bishop of Lyon, bishop of Antioch, bishop of Rome, right? Which is the Pope's formal title. He's the bishop of Rome, right?
Okay. And does this also relate to something you'd said many episodes ago, that Christianity started as an urban religion?
Yes, it was primarily an urban religion, right?
Okay.
So like, this is why it's based in cities, Okay, so you get that, you get these different, and they all, legitimacy is by what we call apostolic succession, right? Mm-hmm. So this is, you can trait in the Catholic telling, we'll use their propaganda now, right? In the Catholic telling, you can trace somebody laid hands on you and ordained you, who had their hands laid on by all the way back to an apostle.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Not necessarily Peter, but just one of the original.
12. Right. One of the 12, right?
Okay.
To somebody who knew Jesus and was chosen by him as a disciple, and yada yada yada.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay. So, and that is what made, according to the Catholic telling, and Orthodox and Episcopalians still buy into this also, some Lutherans, although I question them, that's what makes that unbroken chain, right, that you can trace yourself in your ordination back to an apostle, is what makes you a bishop, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're almost in a sense, a spiritual scion.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah, you're a spiritual scion of somebody who was a spiritual scion, going all the way back to
the original.
Right, the original, right? So, okay. A couple things are happening through this, right? On the one hand, in the eastern side of the empire, almost every bishop on the planet can trace right? The apostles ran around the east all the time. That was actually where they focused most of their attention, right?
Okay.
So Turkey, Syria, Egypt, they're all over the place. So every bishop, there is nothing special in the East about tracing your lineage back to an apostle, right? Because everybody's got it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
and it's very clear for them.
Right, and it's very clear for them, right? I'm the bishop of, Ephesus, right? Major one. John was here. I'm the bishop of Corinth. Paul was here. Like that kind of, right? Like I'm the bishop of, I'm the bishop of Alexandria. Mark was here. He wrote a gospel.
Yeah.
Right? Like that kind of thing. Right? You could do it in the East. It wasn't a big issue because everybody could prove it. Right? Then you get the West, Western Roman Empire.
And here the trouble begins.
Well, and in the West, the only person who can do it is Rome. Because it's the only place in the West the apostles actually went. That we know, that we have confirmed record, that we have like tradition and records of, right?
Yeah.
So Peter was bishop of Rome and ordained his successor, who I think is Linus. I forget who ordained his successor and yada, yada, yada. And Linus was Clement and, et cetera, et cetera. But the only city that can claim that in the whole Western Roman Empire is Rome. So all the other bishops in the Western Roman Empire have to get their ordination through Rome. Right? Rome, the Pope, whether he has authority or not, he has to be there at their ordination or send a representative, so that they can have this apostolic succession thing.
Yeah.
Right? So quickly you get this different structure of churches, right? In the East, you get a more collegial model of bishops because everybody has this apostolic succession thing.
Yeah. In a way, no one's above any other because it's just a difference between which apostle
you're tracing it through, right?
Yeah.
Yada, yada, yada. In the West, you've got this totally different model that's evolving.
Because you have a singular source.
Because you have a singular source, Rome.
Yeah.
Right? And Rome has kind of double authority because both Peter and Paul were there. Right?
Yeah.
Does that make,
Yeah, it makes sense. They were both there. They both died there.
Right. They both died there. You could only trace it, On top of that, you get a language barrier that starts developing. In the West, they spoke Latin. In the East, they spoke Greek. Right? And these cultures have two very different cultures. In the East, they're more philosophical, right? So in the East, the bishops are all debating questions about the nature of Christ and his relationship to the Father and yada, yada, yada. Yeah. In the East, the East is Latin, and Latin's a legal language.
West,
right? Or the West, right.
Okay.
In the West, they're speaking Latin, and the Romans and Latin language is a legal language, and so they think legally. And so in the West, they're coming up with terms like sacrament, and they're defining, worship practices, and they're acting like lawyers.
Yeah.
They're
so
coming up with
rules and procedures.
Right, they're coming up with rules and procedures, right? It
Okay.
leaves the two branches with, this is why the East and the West act very differently. They're sourced from very different origins.
Yeah.
Right. Make sense so far?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
I'm making sure with our live studio audience. Okay.
We are not yet to the Council of Nicaea. Okay.
A little teaser there.
Right. Out of all these bishops running around in apostolic succession, there are 5 bishops that start having kind of super authority.
Okay.
Right. We call this the pentarchy. Right. It's the Bishop of Rome. These are also called the patriarchs, right? It's the Bishop of Rome, whose title used to be, until he gave it up recently, the Patriarch of the West, right?
Okay.
There's the Archbishop of Constantinople, right? Who to this day is the ecumenical patriarch, right?
Okay.
The Archbishop of Antioch, right? Who is right, there's several of them, but the Archbishop of Jerusalem and the Archbishop of Alexandria, and those form what's called the pentarchy. And these bishops begin having, and this is simply because of the biggest cities in the empire. These are the 5 biggest cities in the empire, so naturally, kind of like how the presiding bishop's office is in Chicago,
right?
And we're a Midwestern denomination, right? The places of these, in addition to there's apostolic authority in these places, but Jerusalem, obviously, yada, yada, yada. But they begin to exert a kind of super authority over various regions, right? And they begin to have precedence in a kind of first among equals kind of way, right?
Now we're like Animal Farm.
Well, yeah, kind of. From there, whenever there was a debate between one of these super bishop, these patriarchs, basically.
Yeah.
The 4 eastern, because notice 4 of them are in the east and one's in the west. Again, there's that division, right?
Yeah.
Whenever there was a debate among them over jurisdiction or among theology, they would frequently bring in the Pope to mediate, the Bishop of Rome.
Was it because he was from the West?
Yeah,
different.
It started off as not because he had authority, but because he didn't have a dog in the fight. His territory wasn't in the East. He didn't even speak Greek, like his church thought different, right? Again, it's this more legal mindset, right?
So for the East, he could be the neutral referee.
Right. He was a neutral mediator, and so frequently you see the Pope in some of the early documents sending a representative or himself coming to early synods, early things, and presiding over them as the neutral mediating party.
Okay.
Weren't they already arguing by this time that the Pope was the successor of Peter, who the church was built on?
We'll get there, right.
Okay. And Keith was asking, does this get to
Yeah.
Peter being the one the church was built on? And
Yeah. So this is line in the Gospel of Matthew where it's right after Peter's confession. And again, so now we can get into true Roman propaganda, right? You know, and so, and I don't mean propaganda negatively, folks on the internet, but don't write to me about how I'm using a bad word. Propaganda is fine, you know, just this is the official messaging line, right,
Yeah.
out of Rome, you know. So there's this line in the Gospel of Matthew. Peter does his confession like he does in every gospel, where Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, the one sent into the world." And then in Matthew, Matthew writes that Jesus says, "Okay, you are Peter," which just means rock in Greek.
Greek, yeah.
"And on this rock I will build my church," right? And that's the Catholic source, ultimate source of authority, is that Jesus gave Peter this kind of super authority, right? So Rome's kind of always arguing it's got this super authority. The East at first kind of recognized, again, in a first among equals sort of way. This is actually, the East would actually reconcile with Rome on this condition, you know, if the Pope would do this, but this is not what the Pope means today by I have
Okay.
authority, you know.
Yeah.
But they would kind of recognize it in a first among equals, we'll honor you, but you don't really have super authority over, you know, what's today Moscow or any of that stuff, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But at first they would kind of recognize, I would say there was a wide recognition of he has precedence in a first among equals sort of way, you know, for all these reasons, for Peter, for the
Now,
fact-
is this like a couple centuries into Christianity?
yeah,
now?
we're getting into right before Constantine kind of territory.
Okay.
Is where we're and through Constantine and later is where we're at.
So roughly 300s.
Yeah, 200s to 200s to 300s, you know, is
Okay.
where he starts arbitrating things in the mid to late 200s, you know. So like there's this controversy called the Donatist controversy, you know, that
It was
yeah.
Saint Duncan and
No, it's
Donation of Constantine.
well, no, this is the Donatist heresy, Donatism. So
so it's nothing to do with Krispy Kreme or
no, not donut, dona, right? Like dona, no. So before Constantine, the emperor before Constantine initiates what's called the Great Persecution. This is the last and the greatest persecution of Christians. This is the empire-wide persecution. This is the one where people were actually fed the lions and stuff like that,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, this is the last empire-wide one, you know, and this went on for like 20 years or so, you know, and there was this problem where a lot of people under threat of torture recanted their faith, you know, including priests and bishops, right? And so once Christianity gets legalized by Constantine, the immediate problem is that there's this whole debate. What do we do with these? Are these sacraments of all these pastors who recanted their faith invalid because they recanted, is the question.
so thus anybody they baptized.
Has to get rebaptized.
Okay.
Yada, yada, yada. You know, all the sacraments they performed are invalid because they recanted and therefore it's invalid. That was the question.
Yeah.
And the
That's-
Donatists said, yes, they're unfaithful. They're sinners. You know, they recanted under torture when people were being martyred. Everybody who was baptized by them has to get baptized again, right? And there was a great debate over this. The church conclusion was the opposite of that. We call that heresy today Donatism, you know, from the Bishop Donatus,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah. And was Donatus one of the ones who recanted under torture?
No, he was one of the he didn't, which is why he was arguing.
Okay. He stayed strong.
Right, he's arguing. It was the rigid hardliner position was you have to rebaptize these people because they thought I survived, I endured torture, I've got the marks from being whipped for being Jesus, Who are you people to be welcomed back in without some serious penance, The church ruled the opposite in the end after a big synod, we called it, They all the bishops gathered together and they debated this, and the conclusion and the Pope was a neutral arbitrator at this one. This is one of the ones where he chaired the meeting because he was a neutral arbitrator.
Okay.
Right.
And did he have the title Pope at that time, or was he still the Bishop of Rome?
He did.
First among equals?
He did. Well, not yet, because Pope traces its title back to the title Pontifex Maximus, which is the High Priest of Rome.
Okay.
And so it's not until the empire literally falls that they technically claim that title. But he's Pope. You can just call him Pope now. He's Bishop of Rome. He's Patriarch of the West. Yada yada yada. Right.
Okay.
So at this synod, he's presiding as chair. Synod decides later that's a heresy. We don't need to get into the rest of it, but they decide that's a heresy, and they come to the opposite conclusion, which is the sacraments are always valid no matter who performed them, because it's not the person performing them, but it's Jesus. So you could get baptized by a mass murderer, doesn't really matter, because it's not about the person, it's about
the Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit and God working,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
That was the church's conclusion. Good conclusion. So from there, you get gradual evolution of the Bishop of Rome is continually arguing, I have this super authority over everybody, including the other four super bishops,
Mm-hmm.
The other four super bishops are kind of saying, we'll sort of recognize you as first among equals, but get off your high horse,
You get to go first through the line.
Right, you get to go first in, the lunch line, but nah, is kind of their argument, right? And to the point, Rome hasn't really consolidated. It's not clear Rome's the first in Italy at this point, much less the rest of the Western Roman Empire, right? Like the Bishop of Milan for a while had actual more power because the emperors were residing in Milan at that point, not Rome, and so he actually had far more authority. By the time the emperors become Christian, than the Pope does, because the Pope's just in this backwater old capital at this point.
Yeah,
I'm
a city of former glory.
Right, I'm in the I sit at the emperor's table, literally in many cases, right?
Yeah.
So at this point, it's not clear who's going to come out on top, but Rome's got this argument that gradually ends up winning the day, so. The bishop gradually consolidates power in Rome itself and then kind of moves out from there, right? So Attila the Hun comes to sack the city of Rome, and it's Pope Leo the Great. Notice Leo, right?
Yeah.
Right. Leos have a mixed history. Leo the X was the one who excommunicated Luther, but Leo the Great saved the whole city of Rome from Attila the Hun. We don't know what he did. It just says he went into the tent and was negotiating with Attila, and he came out, and Attila decided not to sack the city.
Wow.
Yeah.
Standing at the gate with 2 skulls.
Yeah, I know. There's that legend. Yeah.
The legend of who? Who stood at the gate with 2 skulls?
Leo. With
okay.
Peter and Paul. Then, went into the tent, negotiated, came out. We don't know what happened. We don't know what they said, but Attila decided to turn his army around and not sack Rome,
Wow, okay.
So at this point, right, like the Pope is effectively in charge of Rome,
Yeah.
right? Like at this point, it's like the Roman emperors have left. Eventually in the West, the empire falls. barbarians are running amok, right, Germans are running across the Rhine,
Yeah, the Visigoths.
right,
Yeah.
they're, society's collapsed at this point. And as society collapses, the only institution that's left is the church, right? And this is where the church starts taking on the trappings of Roman bureaucracy. And the titles of Rome, like vicar, for example, is actually... vicar actually began as a title for a Roman official, right? And
Substitute for the Pope,
right,
basically.
and so like you start taking on these trappings of the Roman bureaucracy to this day that still exist because Rome fell in the West,
And they just moved into that vacancy.
and they moved into that vacancy.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does.
So that's kind of where
Hearing this sequentially, it's
right. It's
see how things
a
are
very
building.
natural development. You get why it happened.
So Western Rome essentially became the mob and the church.
Yeah.
so.
Right. Yeah, so
Relay.
Keith said, the Western Church basically the mob and the church. That's what the Western Roman Empire morphed into. Right?
Yeah.
There were two paths. It was either the church or the mob. Which path are you going?
And either way, you kiss the ring. So.
Right. Yeah. Right. So that's basically to this day where we're kind of, there are mutual excommunications in there and stuff like that. But the story from there on out is Rome's authority grows and grows and grows until you get into about the High Middle Ages. So the 1100s, when Rome finally really consolidates its authority over the whole West, you would say, by various means, whether by conquering or by, whether by conquering or whether by winning the argument. By the 1100s, you've got all the things of the modern papacy, right?
Yeah.
So like even the conclave tradition dates to this period when
Wow.
in the 1200s they went a couple of years without electing a pope, and the people of Rome got so tired of it they literally kidnapped all the cardinals and threw them in a room and just locked them in there and refused to feed them until they came out with a pope.
And that's how the conclave...
And that's how conclave started. And then they set fire to the ballots to let them know they'd actually elected somebody, so they would let them out. And that's literally how that tradition started. It worked so well, they said, let's keep doing it, except we'll feed ourselves, this time. But
So this again gets to the mob, right? So the mob kidnaps them and puts them in the conclave?
at this point, the literal mob of the people of the city. Because at this point, the
Okay.
Bishop of Rome is still...
Some of them are mobs.
Yeah. At this point, the Bishop of Rome is still the bishop, right? He's got duties in Rome in addition to running the church, and so the city was, and also he's running the whole city itself, so they don't have a leader.
Yeah, because there was also a papal state, right? I mean, papal lands in Italy.
Right, around
Okay.
this time they start actually running pieces of Italy, right? So people are really tired of not having a leader, and so they literally just riot and kidnap the cardinals,
I love that.
Yeah, and they said, it worked so well, let's keep doing it, and they developed fancy traditions around it, but it's the same.
That's where it actually began.
Yeah, that's where it actually begins, So that's how by the High Middle Ages you get, what we think of as the papacy.
And so through that period, I know a little later we get to like the Medicis and essentially secular power players positioning their family members to be the Pope.
Correct.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean,
There's a long history there.
Somebody asked Pope Benedict XVI, whether he thought God chose the popes, and he actually paused, and he went, "Well, I can't say absolutely yes because there's been too many bad ones."
Benedict said that.
Yeah, Benedict
Wow.
said that. Right. It's basically what he said.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the Pope claims for himself by the Middle Ages, by right of being, Christ's vice regent, Christ's vicar on earth, a kind of super political authority. Well, yeah, and through lots of other arguments, right?
Yeah.
There's this document that they totally forged that said Constantine gave the popes the entire Western Empire. They totally made that one up. That one, it was proved to be a forgery right before the Reformation. It was one of the bad press things that was happening as the Reformation
That helped
was
contribute to.
Yeah, right. And you know, through various forged and not forged arguments, they made this argument that they have this authority over kings, you know, and as these early on, as these barbarian kingdoms are getting formed, right, they would frequently get baptized, and they get baptized by the Pope, you know, because kings want to be baptized by the biggest bishop they can find, and
that's the one.
That's the one, right? And so and so these various, the Pope argued, I created you, basically. You know, our institution, and in some cases is literally true. Like the Kingdom of Hungary, their Independence Day isn't independence from a country, but it's the date Saint Stephen was baptized, the first king of Hungary.
Oh, wow.
You know,
Yeah.
because that legitimized them as a
nation.
They weren't a barbarian tribe at that point; they were a country. You know,
Wow, okay.
And so like, you know, to this day, that's Hungary's like independence, like, you know, big Independence Day. You know, and so they made this argument: I'm in control. I have more authority than you because I made you. You know, now try that with your kids. It doesn't really work.
It does not work out well.
Right,
no.
you know, and so people argued this, but it also meant there was, at the same time, Rome has, like, because of the church is this organized central bureaucracy in a world that doesn't have centralized bureaucracy. It's incredibly wealthy. It's incredibly powerful. It's got a monopoly on the one good nobody else can provide, salvation itself, right? You know, where we don't think about this, but people died a lot more back then, you know, and so it's like, this is the one good the church has that nobody else can provide. You know, there's a lot of money. Where there's a lot of money, there's a lot of corruption.
Yeah.
You know, and so you begin getting things like people start trying to buy whole bishoprics, right? We call that that's called the sin of simony, trying to buy church office. You know, we've actually got a term for it. You know,
Is that because of the magician Simon?
Yeah, right. That's where we get it from, Acts, right? But right, where he tried to buy the Holy Spirit. That's the sin of buying church offices, because like nobles like to put their second or third son in a bishopric. It was nice to have
Have an insider there.
have an insider in the system, and he could direct funds, and you know, and the Pope was okay with that sometimes, depending on, you know, what building project he was working on in Rome, you know, because I need funds, right? And this corruption builds and builds and builds until you get the Reformation, which is kicked off by the Pope Leo X wants to build St. Peter's. It's literally St. Peter's Basilica, that giant building that they have there to this day, that started the Reformation. Because they needed a new church, because the old one that had been built by Constantine was looking a little run down, you know, and starting to fall apart. And so they had Michelangelo design this grand, gigantic building. Well, you need a building fund,
Yeah.
right? And so he took out a loan from the Medici, Leo X, from the Medici bank, right, to pay for the building. Okay, but you got to pay the loan off. How do you pay the interest? And
Churches in Germany.
right, and so from there he said, "Oh, I got this great idea. Let's issue a plenary indulgence, you know, and we'll raise money through plenary indulgences," which had happened a billion times, still happen to this day, actually. You know, sometimes, you know, it happens all the time. The problem is, because the church was in debt. They gave this task over to the Dominicans. Well, the Dominicans are a little bit aggressive, right? Especially at this time. It's kind of what they're known for. They're known to be a bit fanatical. And specifically, they gave the job in Germany to a guy named John Tetzel, right? Who was more fanatical than most Dominicans, right? So Pope told him to go sell indulgences. By God, he was going to be the best indulgence seller there was.
Yeah.
You know, and so he starts selling in way. This isn't, again, papal approved per se. Like, this isn't actually official doctrine. But John Tetzel used to run around Germany saying things like, this will save anybody. You know, he said, I could violate the Virgin Mary herself, and if I had one of these, I'd be safe.
Wow.
You know, and he starts...
So he was doing the patent medicine version of indulgences.
Yeah, right. Like, he's, you know, out there, you know. And so then you got two problems. You've got, and now we're getting into the history of the Reformation, but you've got this problem of German money is going to Italy, right?
So it's draining the economy.
Right. That's actually part of Luther's biggest deal. He's like, why is German money going to Italians, you know, to rich Italians at that, you know, when we could keep it here? There's a nascent nationalism kind of forming here, you know, so it's like, why is German money going, even though it's all part of the same empire, why is German money going to Italy, you know, to rich Italians at that, you know, when it could be here to help poor Germans, you know. So there's that problem, you know, and then there's the doctrinal problem too of, you know, all that.
Buying your way out.
Right.
And we're going to pause there.
And
I
that's-
should have known we're going to need to do two
sessions.
episodes
Right.
on the papacy.
Right.
So part one brings us up to
The Reformation. 1517, Luther hears a little Dominican monk named John Tetzel bit too many times and in fury nails something to the front door of his church to say, stop it.
Stop it now.
Yeah. Well, and we'll leave off here, but Luther intends it to be a debate because he's an Augustinian monk, right? And so he wants a debate. This is actually what Luther was aiming for the whole time. He's aiming for an inter-Catholic debate, the Augustinians versus the Dominicans, you know. And that's actually what he's originally aiming. He doesn't understand why this is causing such a ruckus. You know, he's like, I just want
to talk about it.
I just want to debate about what the Dominicans are doing in Germany, you know, presided at ideally by somebody like the emperor or somebody like that, so that the German Holy Roman Emperor can make a decision about whether we are do we want the Dominicans to do this in our territory or not, you know, and is it theologically appropriate, you know. That's the reason he posted the 95 Theses. It's just then the printers got a hold of it, and it went crazy after that.
So it's supposed to be 95 debate topics, basically.
Well, that's all theses are, right?
Yeah.
Like, these are the 95 propositions I want for debate, you know?
Yeah.
Right? And so...
You take the first affirmative, and I'll...
Right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, his point is, right, like, position one, right? When our Lord and Master, Jesus Christ, said, repent, he willed that the entire life of Christian be repentance. And then Theses 2, this does not refer solely to the sacrament of repentance and forgiveness, you know, but refers to the entirety of the Christian life.
Yeah. So he wanted us to go point by point through it, settle each one, and then...
Right. Then point 3, right, is therefore the selling of indulgences are not a part of the Christian life.
Yeah.
You know, like, and literally it's an argument if you read it. It's, you know, it's not just 95 things I have a problem with, but it's an argument.
I mean, we get into part 3 on this then. 2 on the papacy, and then going through the propositions of the
Yeah,
great
we could
debate.
do that. They get really tiresome after a while because Luther didn't have an editor. Well, he really wanted to drive this point home. So, like, you know, he spends like 10 theses going like, if the Pope, because the argument from the Pope's side was, it was called the treasury of merit. Mm-hmm. You know, I have all the church has built up all this merit from the saints, and I can release it whenever I want, right? And Luther then spends about 10 points in the middle of the theses going, if the Pope could forgive everybody in purgatory, why hasn't he?
Yeah.
You know, and if the Pope...
I mean, he's not nice guy?
Right. Like, if the Pope had this power, why is he doing it for money? And why hasn't he spends there's about 10 to 15 theses in the middle there.
Yeah.
Like, I get it, Luther, okay.
That's cool.
Also, Germany was the only one being charged.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the churches in France were being charged.
Right. That was...
Churches in
And
England or
Steve's pointing out that Keith is pointing out that it was the German churches seem to be the target of all this as opposed to France.
Yeah, well,
But I'm going to pause
yeah, we'll
because
pause
we can
there.
keep going.
We could keep going.
Steve is
right.
digging this, by the
Yeah.
way. So we're definitely doing a part 2.
Okay.
But he did have a question as we began, and I want to do that, and then we'll wrap.
Okay.
Why do people think that we normal humans, speak for yourself, Steve, have the right or wisdom to pick a human that will speak for the entire faith? And maybe that's for next week.
Yeah, I
Because
mean,
we're getting to the theology here.
you're right. That is the theology. The short answer to truly answer your question, there's a human organizational principle, which is like organizations need leaders.
Yeah.
And like, actually, if you read Lutheran confessional documents, our actual stance on the papacy, the official line, is we would recognize the Pope and acknowledge his authority, parentheses, by human traditions. Like we deny we agree with you, Steve. It's kind of ridiculous to be like, God ordains this one person, we deny that, But we said for organizational principles and for the sake of good order, we would recognize his human authority, that tradition has said this one guy's in charge.
Yeah, we need a CEO.
We need a CEO. We'd be fine. Our documents actually say we'd be fine with that if he but allowed the teaching of the gospel, And so like, our confessional documents, that's the part that gets Catholics mad. But our confessional documents don't think there's a problem with that one guy's in charge, right? Every companies have that. Churches have that, right? The buck stops somewhere.
Yeah.
Kings, presidents, we do that all the time. We don't have a problem with that principle. We have a problem with you arguing that there's some biblical theological reason for that person instead of just good human organizational principle, which is really what is going on here.
And we'll leave it on
And we'll leave it there.
that Pope Benedict apparently somewhat agreed with that.
Yeah, I mean, right. Yeah, we'll leave it there, right?
Yeah.
We'll get into that later.
There's a lot of nuance in
There's a
all
lot
this.
of nuance there, yeah.
This may be ongoing, but at least one more part for sure.
Right. Yes.
So, yeah, and Steve, if you have more people questions, get them to us through the week, because we are back next week, right?
Yes.
As far as we know.
As far as I know.
Okay, so that'll be cool. More papal history and nuance coming up.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this one.